As Christians, many of us have this idea in our minds that if we had been alive during the times of slavery, the Holocaust, or other societal injustices, that we would have done what was right. We would have stood up, condemned it, freed slaves, and hidden Jews in our homes. And if you have thought that, but you have also remained silent on the issues of abortion, then you have been lying to yourself. The Holocaust killed 6 million. Stalin killed 20 to 50 million. Mao Zedong killed 45 million. And since 1973, 65 million children have been brutally murdered. We are living through the greatest genocide in human history. And it is our duty as Christians to stand up, to say something, and to understand the great evil that has gripped our culture for so long. Welcome to Beyond the Headlines. I'm your host, Rachel Cooper, and today we have a bit more of a serious topic in front of us. We're going to be talking about the road to genocide, how eugenics began as the motivation for the greatest evil in human history. In order to understand this, we're going to first talk about what eugenics is and some of the early history surrounding it, and then we'll dive into who Margaret Sanger was and how she used eugenics as the beginnings of her racist motivations for Planned Parenthood. And then I'll talk a little bit about the Negro Project, which was a project started by Sanger in the early 1900s. So now you may hear the term eugenics thrown around fairly loosely and kind of understand some of what it is, but maybe you don't know the vast history that it's had in America. Because before the late 1800s, it really wasn't a concept. Really, no one had thought of it. Charles Darwin, the famous scientist who came up with natural selection, actually used the concept of natural selection to come to the conclusion that white people were the best race. He used this to think that Black people's race was the closest to apes, and therefore white people were the furthest, and therefore their race was the best. It was the most valuable. But Charles Darwin wasn't actually the one who came up with the idea of eugenics. No, see, that was his cousin, Francis Galton. Francis Galton was the father of eugenics. And you might actually be familiar with some of his work. He came up with the idea of nature versus nurture. So if you've ever heard that term, that was from him. But he was incredibly impacted by Darwin, reading many of his works. And this is what Britannica actually has to say about eugenics. Eugenics is the selection of desired heritable characteristics in order to improve future generations, typically in reference to humans. The term eugenics was coined in 1883 by British explorer and natural scientist Francis Galton, who, influenced by Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection, advocated a system that would allow the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. What I just told you, the concept of eugenics, may sound fine. It may sound like, okay, we just want the best for the human race. But really what it is playing God to select the humans most valuable and most worthy of reproducing and of living. It is the idea that as human beings, we don't have inherent value. No, our inherent value is what we do, what we contribute to the society, the very antithesis of what we believe as Christians. But you don't actually have to just take my word for it. Thankfully, Francis Galton was so kind as to write many books which expand upon his evil ideas. One of this was his discussion on preventing parenthood. In his book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, he writes, "The few best specimens of that race can alone be allowed to become parents, and not many of their descendants can be allowed to live. On the other hand, if a higher race is substituted for the low one, all of this terrible misery disappears. The most merciful form of what I ventured to call eugenics would consist in watching for the indications of superior strains or races, and in so favoring them that their progeny shall outnumber and gradually replace that of the old one." What I just read to you is the idea that Francis Galton had to exterminate the lesser races. And you might be asking yourself, well, which race is he talking about? Which one is the superior? White people, of course, obviously. And who is the less suitable? Black people. He wrote about this in his book Heredity Genius, in the chapter Comparing Worths of Different Races. And in this, he talks about how the non-European races, African races, are inferior to Europeans, specifically British people. According to him, the ancient Greeks were the most ableist and the best race of humans that we should all strive to try and replicate. And so this is the beginning of eugenics. Now that we understand exactly what eugenics is, in the discrimination against human beings and their value, we can now kind of understand the readings and the thought process that Margaret Sanger became familiar with when she was beginning Planned Parenthood. So Margaret Sanger, who started Planned Parenthood, grew up with many different siblings. Her father was very politically involved in socialist and communist organizations, and he was also staunchly anti-Catholic. Even when her and her siblings would go to school, her father would try and push back against some of the organized religion that they would bring home. And that's a lot about what she wrote about in her autobiography. But what's most concerning in her autobiography is what she chose to publish in her own words. She wrote about a story in particular which is very concerning. There was a woman, one of her neighbors, who fled to their house clutching a baby in her arms. What had happened was her abusive husband had returned home from a long day at work. Their child had a condition which forced this baby to cry. The baby was very uncomfortable, and so there was continuous crying. And the father couldn't stand it. So the father took the baby, threw it outside into the snow, and the mother then clutched the baby, running to their house for refuge. And you might be asking yourself, okay, well, obviously this enrages Margaret Sanger. Obviously this would enrage any sane human being. But no, this is what Margaret Sanger had to write. Ugly and taciturn though he was, I could picture him coming home after a hard day's work to a household racked with the shrieks of the suffering little thing. I could see that he too was pathetic and a victim, and I had sympathy for his rage. Margaret Sanger, in her own words, wrote that she had sympathy for the rage of an abusive father and husband. Anyone who publishes that, anyone who thinks that, should not be remotely involved in the decision-making or the influence of our society and culture. That is evil, vile, and disgusting. But that is what Margaret Sanger quoted as one of the first awakenings that she had, one of the first stories that she can remember that allowed her to think, oh, maybe there's a problem here and we need to fix it. But the problem wasn't the abusive father. The problem wasn't the drunk father throwing his baby into the snow. No, in fact, the problem was actually the children. That was the conclusion she came to. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Margaret Sanger then says that when her mother got sick and ill, she then wanted to become a nurse to try and find a cure for this. She was unsuccessful and her mother passed away, so Margaret Sanger still continued to pursue nursing. She actually was not successful and she ended up not finishing college. But in her autobiography, she writes about her experience as a nurse in training, and that she was consistently drawn to poor people, poor neighborhoods, that she was consistently drawn to what she would refer to as the feeble-minded. And it was actually the first woman that she witnessed die that inspired her motivation to look into birth control. This was the beginning of eugenics. Margaret Sanger, in her observations about different poor people and what they were going through, concluded that children were the problem. She used children as a scapegoat for the problems of parents. Inherently, that is what she did. In The Pivot of Civilization, she talks about this extensively. And one of the things that she says here is, quote, out of this family of the 11 children, only 2 are now of any use to society. The father has become a hopeless drunkard, of whom the mother and children live in terror. All of our problems are the result of overbreeding among the working class. No, the problem is not the hopeless drunkard who the parents, the mom and kids are terrified of. No, the problem is actually the children. This is an evil and disgusting idea, which is the starting point of Planned Parenthood. She connects the use, saying only 2 are of any use to society, to the human value that a human being has. She actually then goes on to, quote, Alfred Frank Tredgold in talking about the value that different human beings have. Tredgold points out that the number of children born to the feeble-minded is abnormally high. Feeble-minded women constitute a permanent menace to the race and one which becomes serious at a time when the decline of the birth rate is unmistakable. Dr. Tredgold points out that the average number of children born in a family is 4, whereas in these degenerate families, we find an average of 7.3 to each. Out of this total, only a little more than 1/3, 456 out of a total of 1,269 children, could be considered profitable members of the community. Margaret Sanger just said that only 1/3 of people are actually profitable. Only 1/3 are suitable. The doctor that she's quoting here, Dr. Alfred Frank Tredgold, was actually incredibly racist and tried to promote tax breaks for more suitable parents to have children and incentivize them more so and de-incentivize anyone that he deemed not worthy to reproduce. He associates worth with different human lives based on profit and how they contribute to society, and talked a lot about the feeble-mindedness of different individuals, which Margaret Sanger echoes in her writing, calling people she deems less accomplished as being feeble-minded continuously. And so this idea, this kind of thinking, was what led Margaret Sanger to found the American Birth Control League in 1921. And Seth Gruber, who's worked extensively looking into Margaret Sanger and eugenics, actually points out that they shared office space with the main eugenics league in America. And they also shared many of the same board members. In fact, in The Pivot of Civilization, Margaret Sanger quotes the Eugenics Education Society's first president, Sir James Crichton Browne. She unabashedly admits her motives in many of her writings, including an article from the New York Times in 1923. What she says here is, birth control is not contraception indiscriminately and thoughtlessly practiced. It is the means, the release, and the cultivation of the better racial elements of our society, and the gradual suppression, elimination, and eventual extirpation of defective stocks, those human weeds which threaten the blooming of the finest flowers of American civilization. That is why Margaret Sanger started Planned Parenthood. To get rid of human weeds, as she called them. To get rid of the feeble-minded. Anyone that she deemed not worthy to contribute to society. That is the beginning of Planned Parenthood. But what's really interesting is that as the Nazi Party grew in Germany and as we began to realize the evils of eugenics, people began to understand that eugenics was inherently evil. So Margaret Sanger had to begin to kind of start covering some of her tracks. And in 1942, the American Birth Control League changed its name to Planned Parenthood to try and distance themselves from eugenics. But there are undeniable ties, not only to Nazis, eugenics, but also to the KKK. One of the board members of Planned Parenthood, or the American Birth Control League, was Lothrop Stoddard. He wrote a piece titled "The Rising Tide of Color Against White Supremacy," published in 1920. It's all about how white people are the best race, how black people are not as suitable. He was also a member of the KKK on the East Coast. And what's really interesting is that some of his writings were actually utilized in Nazi textbooks. That was one of the founding board members of the Planned Parenthood. The Nazis used him to teach their propaganda. And when he went to Germany to go visit and see what the Third Reich was doing, he was actually set up with a visit to Heinrich Himmler, who was the second in command at the Nazi Party. That is how much the Nazi Party esteemed what we were doing in America with eugenics. We were the blueprint for what happened in World War II. The evils and atrocities committed by Margaret Sanger and the American Birth Control League inspired Nazi Germany. But what's worse is Lothrop also coined the term that Nazis use to refer to people that they did not think were fit to live. The term was Untermensch, meaning subhuman. That is what the Nazis used to try and get people to think that some humans were of less value because they were subhuman. Yeah, maybe they were human, but they were subhuman. So it's okay if we kill them. Those are the racist eugenics beginnings of Planned Parenthood. And that is just touching the surface. In my research, it was almost overwhelming. Every time Margaret Sanger would quote someone, it was not a question of if they were racist, but simply how racist they were. So it's no surprise that Margaret Sanger then decided that it was time to start the Negro Project, as she so called it. The Negro Project was an inherently racist project started to try and give more funding to birth control in specifically Black communities. Okay, and a lot of the propaganda that Margaret Sanger put out about this was, oh, we simply want to help Black people. We want, we understand that overbreeding is a really big problem, so we want to help Black people prosper. But if you remember some of the writings that I just quoted of Margaret Sanger's, obviously she's saying that she's calling these families degenerate, feeble-minded. Obviously, this is not something that she wants to do to help people, but in order to help her racist agenda, because she believes that more Black people or more feeble-minded individuals is going to be the detriment of the human race. That is why the Negro Project was started. But you don't have to take my words for it, because in the proposal to start the Negro Project, she actually quoted W.E.B. Du Bois in the Birth Control Review. He entitled A Negro Number. This is what he had to say about Black people and reproduction. On the other hand, the mass of ignorant Negroes still breed carelessly and disastrously, so that the increase among Negroes, even more than the increase among whites, is far from the part of the population least intelligent and fit, and the least able to rear their children properly. Du Bois did not think that Black people were worth reproducing, and neither did Margaret Sanger, because that is what she quoted in her proposal to start the Negro Project. It was in her proposal that she wrote to Dr. Albert Lasker, who is now we know as the father of modern advertising, and he was the one who originally gave $20,000 to start the Negro Project. He and his wife, Mary started the Mary and Albert Lasker Foundation, and they were considered philanthropists who gave generously to many different medical campaigns. But what's really interesting here is that one of the things that she says when she's beginning to start this is she says, if we can get the Negro universities and the Negro medical groups behind this project, it will go over, I think, really big, especially if there's a little money to give to those for time spent and supplies in their clinics. Okay, so the beginnings of the Negro Project were, let's get high-ranking Black people on board with this, and let's give them money, and we're getting this money from philanthropists, from modern advertising. What I think is really interesting about this is that Planned Parenthood generally still operates in a lot of the same way. There's a lot of high-ranking Black individuals that say, no, this is good, Planned Parenthood is good for Black people, and also, by the way, all of those companies that you're buying your gas, your coffee, many different of your products from, they are the ones who fund Planned Parenthood. Oh, and don't forget about your tax dollars. That also goes to fund Planned Parenthood. At least it did for many years. So the beginnings of Planned Parenthood and the beginnings of their racist ideology is really still very similar to what we see today. And one of her most infamous quotes, which is something that you may have already heard, was in a letter that she wrote to Clarence Gamble. Clarence Gamble of Procter & Gamble was actually appointed to medical field director in December of 1937 of Planned Parenthood. This is the infamous quote. She wrote this in a letter to him in 1939. We do not want word to go out that we want to exterminate the Negro population. And the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs to any of their more rebellious members. That was what the Negro Project was. It was a propaganda driven in order to try and tell Black people that they were not deemed worthy, they were not fit to reproduce. But don't worry, white people have it all figured out for you. Just take this birth control, just take what we give you, and it'll all be okay. The beginnings of Planned Parenthood, the beginning of 65 million children being brutally murdered in the womb, was the idea that children were the problem. It was not parents, it was never parents, it was children, and it was specifically Black children. America was the blueprint for Nazi Germany. If you've ever thought to yourself as a Christian, you just cannot understand, you cannot comprehend the evils of Nazi Germany, of all of these different massive genocides, you need to think the exact same thing about abortion. Because Margaret Sanger was incredibly conniving, and she knew something that Hitler didn't do. Eventually, she knew that people wouldn't like it. They wouldn't like their friends and family being brutally murdered. But she knew that with birth control, with abortion, with Planned Parenthood, that people really wouldn't see it. They wouldn't look into it as much. If she spun it into this propaganda that it was best for the very people that were committing their own genocide, then people would take it. She knew that a spoonful of sugar would help the medicine to go down. And that is why we as Christians need to stand up. Many people say, oh, well, it's not loving if you speak out against abortion. No, it's not very loving to remain silent and let people die and be killed. It's not very silent to remain silent. It's not very loving to remain silent in the face of a massive human genocide. That is why it's important that we understand what eugenics is, why it is so evil, because it is still taking place in this country today in many ways other than abortion, and it's still taking place all over the world. We have to understand how incredibly racist Margaret Sanger was, the beginnings of eugenics, and of course, the beginnings of the Negro Project. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Beyond the Headlines. I know this was a bit more of a serious topic, so I thank you so much for bearing with me on this. It's an incredibly important topic, and I would appreciate this if you would share it with any of your Christian friends or anyone else who's concerned about abortion and what's happening in this country today. Come again next week for another episode of Beyond the Headlines.